Good afternoon, everyone. It's Tuesday, the 16th of August, and welcome to this meeting of the Standards Panel. We have one member of the public, who is actually one of our independent persons present. Just for the record, I'm Jake Baharia. I'm one of the other independent persons, and as is normal practice, an independent person chairs panel meetings if you are available. Just as a reminder to the usual things, do I need to go through the usual blurb, or are we reasonably familiar with this? So no emergencies planned. It's an official recording, so please don't rattle your jewellery when you're speaking or when others are speaking. Others may film but and record, but please don't disrupt. And make sure your mobiles are off, please. I think everyone's done that. Are there any apologies for absence?
We have one apology for absence, Chair, and that's from Councillor Claire Davis.
Right, and we have a substitute?
We do. We have Councillor Bolton substituting for Councillor Claire Davis.
Thanks. Does anyone have any declarations of interest to make?
Yes, I do, Chairman. It's to do with case number 14, appendix 14 rather. I am no longer a parish councillor of Bristow Parish Council, but at the time of this complaint, I was a member of that parish council. So the complaint against the councillor, I was on that parish council at the time. I just thought it was best if I declared an interest.
Right.
At that.
Thank you. That should not be relevant. It shouldn't be germane to the discussion, but thanks for noting that. Any other declarations of interest?
If I can just make a point that if you can remind everyone attending not to name.
Yeah, I haven't quite got to that yet. I'm about to. Right. Let's move to the next discussion, which is to consider whether the panel will be excluding the press and the public. The monitoring officer has provided information which suggests that there is a case for excluding public and the press because there is information which might be likely to reveal the identity of an individual. Practice from these meetings, which began when I first chaired the first one of these, was that our view was the public interest in the effective functioning of the standards process was far more important than the preservation of made it more important that the public was available to examine what was happening and hear what was happening than to consider the confidentiality issues. The way to deal with that we agreed was that in any of the cases that we discussed, we would not identify either the name of the subject member or the complainant or the parish council involved. And so that we would refer to these by the numbers by which they are listed on the documentation which we have, and talk about the subject member or the complainant if it's necessary to do so, but not to use the names. Can we all agree to abide by that practice? I don't know, Polly, have you had that experience of working with this committee before?
No, I haven't, so I will abide by the general consensus.
Okay, thanks. But I know that Nigel and Christy have both had that experience, and certainly Richard has as well. Okay, so we are therefore agreeing that this meeting will be held in public. In the event that it becomes necessary to start talking about named individuals or a named council, then we will have to ask that for that moment the public be excluded. That's acceptable to everyone?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Well, in that case, let's move on to the main item for the agenda, which is the sampling and monitoring officer decisions. And can I ask Alice to introduce this, please?
Certainly. So the purpose of today's meeting is for you to undertake a review of the decisions made by the monitoring officer and those with delegated authority from her between the dates of the 1st of May 2021 and the 30th of April 2022. These complaints include those made against parish, town and county councillors, and all complaints received and closed during the period are included as appendices to this report. Just to be clear, where a complaint has been withdrawn, it will not be considered by the standards panel as a decision has not been made by the monitoring officer in relation to that complaint. So, sorry, further, as outlined, so we will now move to taking the appendices in order. Starting with Appendix 2.
Well, okay, but you have some comments at the beginning, and I'd just like to pick up a general point first, which is about timeliness.
Fine.
Because you made the point about timeliness. And I think this is something where certainly the independent persons have raised questions and are particularly concerned about a number of factors, including timeliness of processes. I mean, we've got before us something like 25 complaints. 60% of them are well out of the time that would be expected for normal practice. And while there might be good, reasonable explanations for each one of them, there is a question about whether the number of reasonable explanations is itself unreasonable. And I think that's something that this panel might want to reflect upon in general, as well as on the specifics.
Of course.
I think there are one or two other points to make about timeliness as well. There are things that haven't been happening that are running in parallel. For instance, there was a panel held in 11th of March, which was an appeal panel, and it was agreed after that that there would be an informal review panel held after that to explore issues that arose out of hearing the appeal. That hasn't happened yet. Perhaps we should have chased it, but it should have happened. There were a number of issues that arose at that appeal, not least the unavailability of key documents. For instance, the evidence of fact about what had happened at various meetings. So I think that's something that needs to happen. We're also not sure at this stage as independent persons whether who's actually dealing with matters relating to standards, because there was a change back in July. And certainly the first I heard of it was when I got a notice saying I wasn't allowed to communicate with that. I didn't have authority to send an email to that member of staff. Things seem to go awry there. And the last point I'd make in general is that we're also concerned about the quality of some of the work. I've had a case as an individual, as an independent person advising a standards a subject member, where it's taken 3 goes to get a coherent decision. That's not questioning whether the decision is right or wrong. That's questioning whether the decision actually makes sense and can be explained to the subject member. And I think that there are questions here about what the level of resource that there is available for standards that are important. Historically, and Richard, you will recall, and you've mentioned earlier informally, the history of standards in Herefordshire. We had a very, very good start. And I think that's something where a lot of respect was built for maintaining standards. And I think that's something that we have to maintain. Difficult in the present political climate because we have a central government that seems to have forgotten about standards. Writing a ministerial code that omits 4 of the 7 Melbourne principles doesn't strike me as a particularly good model. That's no excuse for a local authority like Herefordshire Council for not trying to maintain the best possible standards and expect of everyone who engages the highest possible standards. So I thought I'd just start by saying that so that we're clear about where we are. And I can say that I am speaking on behalf of the 3 remaining independent persons. Another one has resigned in the past 2 months. She resigned because she was very unhappy with the length of time it was taking and the effort that was being put in to deal with standards matters. I think I ought to say that at the beginning. Do you want to respond to that, Alice?
You will appreciate it's somewhat difficult for me to respond to historic failings. I have certainly, I believe I spoke to you back in July when I'd just taken post. I have since spoken to 2 of the other independent persons. I am Deputy Monitoring Officer at the current time. I have acknowledged the issues that have been, but I wouldn't really want to go any further than that. It is an unfortunate position I find myself in. You are considering complaints in the past 12 months for those who have now left the authority. So I'm not going to ask your forgiveness, but I am going to ask for your understanding.
Well, I think also what I would certainly be looking for, and I'm sure my colleagues as independent persons would be looking for, is the assurance that things will improve.
I have given you my personal assurance that I will be doing my best.
Well, and then can I also ask that the members of the Audit and Governance Committee take this on board and bear in mind the comments that we're making, so that can be...
Your comments have been noted, particularly about the length of time documents. That is not, I might add, particular to the Standards Committee.
I'm sure it isn't. I'm sure it isn't, but I think it's important that we maintain. This as independent persons, this is our only opportunity to speak, and I think we should make very clear to councillors and to officers what our views are on this.
Noted.
Thanks. Shall we now move on? There is a question. Do we want to? Sorry,
can I ask a question about the officers' report?
Yes.
That's right. I was going to ask if you have an average of the number of days for dealing with the complaint. Obviously, the target, I think, is 50 or 55.
The target is 55, having done a very rough calculation. So I'm a lawyer. I believe it's 62 days, because you will note that there is a large variation in the number of days and taken to determine the 25 complaints in front of you.
It may be more appropriate to use a median rather than average for this. And I think the median suggests that it's certainly well over 55, simply because, as I say, 60% of the cases are well over the 55.
Noted.
So the median position is somewhere above 55.
But I think whether we calculate the mean or a median, if we can use that as a benchmark for then determining whether there is improvement in the future, it gives us a clear pointer, as it were, going forwards, because these meetings obviously tend to happen probably once in 6 months.
There is an indication of that, simply because if we look towards the bottom of the sheet, the summary sheet, and over the page, most of those are much shorter periods. So it looks as though there's a catching up. However, there are, I think, 9 outstanding cases, so we don't know what the timescales.
Indeed, and my next question is, through the chair, was of those 9 outstanding cases, do we know what date the earliest of those cases was?
Is that something you can answer?
If it's something,
It's not information I've got immediately to hand. I can provide it to the panel after this meeting, and I will do so.
I think that might be
You
well
can
of
take that?
interest. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, could we have that, please?
Certainly.
Thank you. Right, any other questions on the general points first? Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to ask a couple of general questions. Because I've sat on a couple of panels before, and I think this is the first time that I've seen, I think 1, 2, 3, 5 times we've outsourced to Cornwall. So I just wanted to get a little bit more background information in terms of how that's come about and the process of deciding which ones do get outsourced to Cornwall.
So our outsourcing to Cornwall is to deal with 2 separate circumstances. The first is to help with our resource challenges, and the decision has been made previously, my understanding, that was done when timelines were getting in excess of the 55 days. The other circumstances where it's not considered appropriate for officers, the monitoring officer or any of those with delegated authority, it's not appropriate for them to consider those complaints due to them being made against county councillors.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense, because I think 3 of them have got quite high number of days open. And the other thing I also wanted to note was, because I think we made a specific change through Audit and Governance to the Code of Conduct about ensuring that we had a second independent person available to provide support for either the subject member or the complainant. And it was really great to see in the notes that this is what has been picked up, and the independent person has been available to provide that support. So I just wanted to thank the independent persons for the time and effort that they must have to put into doing that, because I think it's very positive.
Thank you for your gratitude. I would make the point, though, that now we are down to only 3 independent persons. We do have to think about how we make sure that we can provide support both to the monitoring officer and to the subject member, because things are beginning to get a bit creaky, and that does raise questions of the recruitment of new independent persons, because our periods of office are coming towards an end. So I hope that would be borne in mind as well, in noting your points.
It has been.
Could I bring you to this? Could I just ask, why in particular Cornwall? I mean, I've been around long enough to remember that it had its own problems with its behaviour.
I'm terribly sorry to answer Andrews, I can't answer that.
No.
I don't
just
believe
wondered
there's
why-
anybody I could ask
Why not someone that's a bit more nearby rather?
I can tell you that the current monitoring officer at Cornwall is actually one of the most highly regarded people in this field at the moment.
Right.
But we don't. But the answer is we don't know.
No. I just wondered because the Nolan rules were actually put in place because of the problems with Cornwall's planning system.
Awesome. Richard.
Chairman, thank you. I was going to bring up this business about delegated decisions, but I think probably I'd prefer to do that at the end rather than at the beginning, because
right.
I've got 1 or 2 points that I'd like to make on that.
Make sure you do. Remind me, please. Right. Are we in a position to move to the appendices? Now, the first question is, do we want to work through all of these? There is a case for doing so. There is a case for saying, let's just do a sample. Are we content to, many of them will not require much comment. Some of them require some comment, probably. That's just my view of it. I'm sure each of us will have different views. Richard, do you want to?
Chairman, thank you again. I've made various comments on various appendices. So if we're not actually looking at a specific one, but I've got a comment, I'd like just to raise that.
Certainly that's what we will do, but I have the same. But I think it's a question of working through whether we're going to look at all of them or sample the appendices.
Or we're here till midnight.
Well, I think we can probably work through them if you're content with that.
Yeah.
I think I'd be happy to go through each one, because I
Okay.
think that's what it says that we should be doing.
Okay, so these are in numbers. I hope my numbering system of the papers matches what was originally provided. So number 2, any comments on number 2? So there was a breach of the code, no appeal, took 190 days, subject member ill. Reasonable decision made? Content with that? Right. Move to number 3 then. No breach found. This appeared to have been a staffing issue that led to a significant delay. Any view, does this seem to be a reasonable decision made by the monitoring officer? Please shout if there isn't, if you dissent, otherwise we'll just work through it. Right. Number 4. And other course of action, slightly less time, but still quite long.
Chairman, this is one of the ones I've never met, but in fact, the subject matter was a county council, but this was not delegated.
Right, would you like to respond to that?
It's apologies, I should be clear, it's cabinet members of the county councillors who are cabinet members.
Oh,
Particular person is not.
And that's why, apologies, that's what the clarification I should have made.
right. point I want to make is that we've had in the past a couple of cases where an individual has been a member of the county council, not necessarily a cabinet member. But the problem is that that council member is an employer of the monitoring officer. And it would be wrong for an employer to be judged by the monitoring officer who is an employee of the council.
Apologies, our employer is the head of paid service.
Yeah, councillors are not employers. It's the head of paid service who's the employer.
I think structurally it's a little different to say the position of a charity, where the trustees are the people who control the organisation and also employ and have management of the contracts.
It is also different at other levels of local government.
Thank you for clarifying that. But I just raised this point because what I am concerned about, that undue pressure could be brought upon the monitoring officer from the subject member who is a member of the county council.
Well, such things are possible, but that is where our role as independent persons becomes quite important. Because the monitoring officer is expected to seek advice, and if we give advice, that's I don't know, Councillor A bops Councillor B on the nose, serious problem. It's a cabinet member. They're two cabinet members having a fight, so they were watching a football match, and there's a complaint. Clearly, the monitoring officer can make a decision, can be fearful about making a decision, but the resource of the independent person is absolutely crucial to this, to make sure that there is an element of.
That's fine. I'm just concerned that it could be that undue pressure is put upon the monitoring officer. But if the independent person is aware of that, then obviously they will be looking at that. I'm
sure that if such a circumstance were to arise, the independent persons would know about it. Yes? Is that a reasonable assumption?
That is a reasonable assumption. And I go back, if we felt that there was the possibility of undue pressure being brought, we would look to outsource that complaint to another authority.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, can we then move on to number 5? This is one of the first that's outsourced, very, very detailed explanation.
Chair, all I would like to comment on is that those queries that were outsourced received a very balanced and thought out response, which sometimes seems to be a bit overboard on the nature of the query, but nevertheless, it sets a very high standard.
I wouldn't want to put words into your mouth, but are you suggesting that that's a standard that perhaps the monitoring officer here should adopt?
It's one perhaps that every council should aspire to.
Right. Any other comments on it? That was no breach found. Again, partly because it was outsourced, but it took
Took a long time.
a very long time, one of the longest.
Yes.
Right. Let's move now to number 6 again. Somehow a lot of the same matters here. Similar complaints, similar people, similar parish. Similar timescale, similar finding. Any comments on it, apart from those?
Once again, I thought we've gone into the commendable thoroughness.
Yes. All right, let's move on. Number 7. Again, a very long time indeed. In this case, the subject member had asked for more time, but there were other delays as well. No breach was found. Is that seen as it's a very, very detailed justification by the subject member. No breach was found. Is that seen as a reasonable finding? We worked through all of the explanations.
sorry, Chair. I'm just a little confused. Oh, your question would suggest that we're here to determine whether or not the outcome of the complaint is correct or not.
No, whether the outcome is reasonable, not whether it's correct. Whether the monitoring officer had acted appropriately in reaching the decision that has been reached, as whether there are cases where it might be possible that and there are one or two that I've got a note for, where the outcome is not just the finding but also the consequence of that may is there a question about its appropriateness? For instance, whether the sanction is appropriate in the circumstance, which isn't a question around whether the finding was correct,
Right.
but is a question about the outcome of the case. Yes.
Right.
So
Okay.
with
that clarification.
Yep. Any other comments on number 7?
I'd just like
Yes,
to comment, Chair, if possible. I don't know whether this is us not, as a council, not communicating the process to the complainants properly, but I think every standards panel I've sat on, there has been a similar complaint about this particular subject member about the use of language. And every time I think it does get rejected because the subject member that's been determined that they're acting in their personal manner, not as a counsellor. But I see this as it comes up time and time again, and I'm not quite sure if there's anything that proactively we could be doing to reduce the occurrence of this, because I think as more and more people use social media, more and more people have their own personal accounts. It is something that we see more and more frequently in the complaints, and it's just increasing the numbers.
Chairman, if I may, on this one, I think this is a case where possibly the county council should look at training for its members on the use of social media and what they should be doing on social media and what is advised they do not do on social media.
Well, I think
that would help.
Can I just add to that? That's about making the distinction between what is done on a personal basis on social media and what's done as a counsellor, but also the assumptions that people make when they see a posting on social media that appears to come from someone they know to be a counsellor, even though they might be acting as an individual.
I quote the case of Livingston MP, where he said some words to an individual, and he claimed he was doing it as a member of the public, not as a council, not as an MP, but he was an MP at the time.
I think that was when he was the leader of the GLA. It wasn't when he was an MP, and he was found to not be in breach of the GLA's code of conduct. I would just draw the panel's attention to that. This finding was of no breach. So the use of social media is catching up with the code of conduct, or the code of conduct is catching up with social media. But we provide training on our code of conduct.
But I don't think training would change how this particular subject member would communicate on their social media, personal social media pages, because it was no breach. But it's the impression that the public, it is quite a fine line, isn't it? And we're seeing more and more of these cases where the public are finding that distressing or upsetting to see some of the language that people are using on their personal accounts and putting in a complaint. But because they're not acting as a counsellor, then there's no breach of the code.
Correct.
Can I just say that I think there may be a justification for that, but there may also be issues around how people perceive things and whether they bring in other judgments that are not just about being a councillor, but maybe about, for instance, ethnic origin or gender, that influence the way people think about these things. And that could also be an important factor. And if people are making different judgments on that basis, then it's very difficult for the council to start talking about training that relates specifically to role as a councillor when there are all these other factors and perceptions that are involved.
I think it is fair to say that the public would find it very difficult to differentiate between what is said in a personal capacity and what is said in the council capacity. I think that is where the problem arises.
Mm-hmm.
However, Chair, I think in the application for registering a complaint, there could be a paragraph which asks that question. Are you certain that the person you're complaining about was acting as a councillor
In their
in their capacity as a
capacity.
councillor and not as a private individual? Because I think that's a question that the complainant needs to ask of their situation, and it's one that they might otherwise be oblivious to if it's not sort of pointed out.
It's a good point. They would have to think.
They would have to think, how were they asking, how were they acting, and it might then. It's not that I want to reduce the number of complaints, but it might well be that they think, oh, actually,
It might clarify the
this might
situation.
clarify why.
The situation a little more
situation
clearly,
occurs,
yes.
Would that be something that would be relatively easy to add to the form? I mean, the wording of it might be interesting to think about.
Changing the form is not difficult, it's the form of wording, but it's certainly something that we can consider as part of the process.
Okay, thank you. Right, can we then, anything else on number 7 then? Let's move to number 8, which is another one in the batch that was looked at by Cornwall. Again, very long time, no breach found. Any comments or views about the outcome? No? If not, number 9. The first one on our list that's actually come in within the target period. You get a gold star for that. No breach found. There was an appeal by the complainant, but that was then withdrawn. That seems, is again, the outcome reasonable in the circumstances? Yes. Yes, that's number 9. Let's move to number 10. At which point my stapler gave up, I think. Number 10 dealt with within the time scale. This is one that involves a member of the council, of the Herefordshire Council. The complaint was rejected by the monitoring officer. So the question there is that a reasonable judgment for the monitoring officer to have made? Generally acceptance of that.
Yes.
Let's move on to number 11. This was found as a breach of the code beyond the target period of 55 days, but not as bad as some, even so, beyond the target. Any questions on this one? I think for me, the question is that there appears to be no sanction or remedy proposed.
The question is, what sanctions and remedy a parish council can do?
Well, this relates to conduct of an individual, which usually results in looking for an apology. So just wonder, perhaps, Alice, any view of why there was no sanction or remedy proposed for this one?
I'm afraid I can't offer a view. This was determined by one of the individuals who's now left from
Right.
authority.
Okay, but I think that there is something here about, that there were actions that were found to have been in breach of the code, but it really does need then something to say what action is proposed, even if it was to say we propose, despite this, we propose no action. Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Okay.
Just on that point, then, if I may,
Yes.
on the actual summary of the decision, could we have possibly a separate heading, say after reasons for decision, we have recommendation, but that would then focus the monitoring officer's attention, recommendation, okay, perhaps we do need a recommendation, or if there's no recommendation, it would actually be there down, no recommendations made.
Yeah.
I think it would just help in the process.
Okay with that? Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Let's move on then. Doing quite well so far. Number 12. Number 12. Breach of the code found. It's got quite complicated because the subject had resigned, so there was a question of whether it was still necessary to pursue this, and it was felt that it was appropriate to pursue this. Which does lead to the fact that at the end there is no recommendation made, because there's no one to make a recommendation about. But does that seem a reasonable decision in the circumstance? Was it, I suppose we could question whether the public interest test was, is that a reasonable application of the public interest test, if we wanted to have a view on that. But no comment on it. No, okay, no. You don't have to comment. It's not compulsory.
I think, Mr. Chair, I'd like to have seen a comment as to why the monitoring officer felt it was in the public interest. So where they're using a public interest test, it's a fairly sort of ambiguous statement, isn't it? So I suppose there is a danger that it could be, used flippantly, but I think it would help the Standards Committee to understand why the public interest sort of issue was met, because I'm not sitting here, I'm not quite sure what the public interest test is. I'm being brutally honest with myself. So I'm not sure whether it's met or not, and therefore I don't know whether I should be, asking the monitoring officer a question about it through yourself.
So
up to you to try and answer something which may be in a history that you don't know.
So I can't answer the public interest test, though effectively is, which is it in the public interest to continue investigating the complaint, or which is given greater weight, continued investigation, or is it of a level where it's not in the public interest to continue investigating? Because that is the question here, is it wasn't that he resigned after the decision had been made. Clearly, the decision was whether or not to continue the investigation. But I take on board your point that it might be better to have some explanations to how that decision was reached.
I would have to say that in looking again at the nature of the complaint and the allegations of misogyny, I can see that would be good grounds for a public interest.
Yes, but it might be better to have that clear on the face of the decision.
Yeah.
And whether, if there's a standard form, I don't know if in terms of the code of conduct, your procedure, in terms of all the things that you have to tick and cross and make sure that you're doing appropriately, and then that just sits within our work papers, so then we can see it at committee. I'm not quite sure the best way.
We
Or
don't-
would it just go in the notes?
We don't have that type of checklist at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. And this comes up rarely. And this
Yeah.
is essentially about where someone's resigned. and there's still, the complaint's still being pursued. So it's not a common occurrence. So
Yeah.
it probably doesn't demand a change to the system just for that.
No, it's more of a, if there is a concern, it's that, you know, what's in the public interest to one monitoring officer may not appear to be in the public interest to another monitoring officer. Some sort of standardisation.
Yeah. I think there is always going to be a matter of personal judgment on these things, even amongst the independent persons.
Oh, sorry.
Right, shall we move on to number 13? Breach of the code found. This is one where I thought that, again, there is no recommendation, and it seemed to me certainly that there was a strong case for expecting an apology on this one.
On the final comment on page 202, final paragraph, is a bit, well, I'm saying this.
I mean, this is one where, first of all, there isn't a heading that says, you know, this picks up your earlier suggestion of having a little heading, but it would seem, it certainly seems, and I think we're agreeing that this is one where there's a strong case for a recommendation from the monitoring officer to this particular subject member, especially given that there seems to be history here. You know, we can't ignore the history of these cases.
Chair, through yourself, can I just have clarification? In terms of where there has been a breach of the code, what is then published in the public domain?
The decision notices, where there has been a breach, so the decision
The
notice
decision notice will be in the public
will be in the public domain.
domain.
Yes.
And is that already in the public domain?
This
Or-
one?
Yes.
Yes, it will be.
Yes, it will be. Okay, thank you.
Right, shall we move on to number 14? This is the one where
I've declared.
you declared an interest, so up to you whether you stay quiet or not. I won't ask you to leave the room. Number 14, no breach found, so no recommendation. The timescales begin to creep down a bit, but they're still above the levels. But any comments or views on number 14? Is it a reasonable outcome? Yeah. Shall we move to number 15 then? Breach of the code found. However, well, there was a recommendation in there about a further written apology, and there was also a question about the declaration of interest form, which has been resolved. Yeah, is that reasonable, Richard?
Yeah, just on that, the recommendation, would it not help if there was a follow-up to the recommendation, whether that's been carried out or not?
Well, that's always a case with apologies, isn't it? I mean, first of all, do you get to know if the apology has been made?
We do ask that parish and town clerks confirm whether or not the apology has been made. If it's not made within a reasonable time, then the complainant is able to ask us to reopen the matter.
Right.
But at the time the decision is published, that was done, because clearly we're now looking at a different code of conduct process. The decision was published 5 days after the appeal period had finished, which may not necessarily have provided, particularly recommendations of public apology. If those are made, we would suggest within a public meeting.
So it would be, I think it would be in everybody's interest, not just the complainant, but also the subject member. If there was something in this paperwork that said the apology was made, or written apology was given on whenever, would it not, or not? Was that just confusing?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be, it would seem that the aim would be to publish the decisions as soon as possible.
Right.
Yes.
In which case the apology may be in the post, but may not
And I
have
would
been
ask you to
received.
remember, we can only make recommendations to parish councils and town councils.
Yes.
We can't actually
Yeah.
require. So it might be that the parish clerk disagrees with our recommendation and doesn't actually seek the apology.
Yes, of course.
As our position on this panel, I guess it's to oversee the monitoring officer process
Yes.
as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yes,
Point
actions of
Yes.
the individual.
Yes, we cannot influence how the parishes work or what the outcomes are with the subject members or the complainants. Apart from that, our focus is.
Well, if the subject member refuses to apologise, we're limited scope.
Well, that then becomes a matter for the complainant to raise as another complaint, and it would come back.
Is that in the general paperwork of when somebody raises a complaint? Are they advised to inform the monitoring officer
So,
if
so in
the
the covering,
recommended action
in
is?
the covering letter that goes out with the decisions, they are made aware of that. Yeah.
Right. Can we move on to number 15, number 16? Oh, yes. I have 2 points to make about this, which are not about the decision of the monitoring officer. One is, as an independent person, I looked at this one and another one. They both had very similar subjects because they were both about planning, and essentially they were both about individuals who decided to buy plots of land for their own companies and try and get planning permission to develop them. And I noted that the other one that we received was full of threats of law and everything else, but this particular one was signed with first name and family. Different approaches, they actually produced the same result, which was no breach. The other point I'd make is that this parish council, because I had to go back and look at their documentation, I was really impressed with the way this parish council appeared to operate. Their website was really good. The documentation they had on it was really clear. It looked like a very well-run parish council. So I think, all credit to them for that. Given that we can't name parish councils at this point, I'm sure appropriate messages can go back. But any other comments on this one?
Only, Chair, that again, it perhaps wasn't clear to the complainant that the subject was acting in a private capacity rather than the capacity as a councillor.
Well, there is a general view of anyone submitting a planning application. I would suggest that anyone who complains is acting in their official capacity, even when they're definitely not. And certainly, I mean, of the 8 complaints that are related to planning that we've got, I think probably 4 or 5 of them are in a similar league to that. And I don't think there's much we can do. This is about what we say to people who are submitting planning applications. People do have a right to object to them. It is allowable. Right. Shall we move on to number 17? A breach of the code found. And a remedy is there. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes.
Yeah, in the circumstance. There are interesting questions about the relationships between the paid officers of parish councils and the council. It's evident that, again, that's there are areas where that gets a bit confused. I think there's another one where there were questions about how people were appointed, but we'll come to that maybe later. Number 18 then. This was an outsourced run. Even though outsourced, it came back in 55 days. Comments, questions, reasonable? interesting comment at the end. While I found no breach of the code of conduct, the subject member needs to be aware that as an elected official, conduct is under regular scrutiny. Little surprising to see that as a statement, because I would have thought anyone elected to public office would regard themselves under public scrutiny all the time. So
Very much so.
the fact that it's actually found necessary to say that is interesting. Any other comments on that? No? If not, number 19. In outsource, they winged it back in just over the proposed time. Had found no breach. Is that reasonable?
Yeah.
Yeah. Reasonable decision made. Number 20. This is one that was rejected. The grounds for rejection was that the complaint is not sufficient to show that the code is engaged. You on that?
No.
That seem reasonable? Yep. Okay. Number 21 then. This is another one that was rejected. Oh, yes, I remember this one as well. Rejected on the grounds that it seemed to be about personal behaviour rather than council. Again, does that seem a reasonable decision to make?
Yes.
Reasonable outcome? Yeah. All right, flip over the page. Number 22. No breach was found. This is a batch of 3 that are interesting because they appear to be closely linked. And the subject matter is around appointment of the parish clerk. And there are some interesting questions there around whether the council is working as it should. Of course, Herefordshire Council has no role to play in that. But I think there are some interesting questions there about whether this council is functioning as it should. And that would apply to 22, 23 and 24. Any views on that?
Chair, accepting that your comment about is the council performing as it should is correct. There's also a common theme amongst the 3 complaints in that the complaint is made, but very little evidence has been provided to substantiate the complaint. Yeah. Which is perhaps the reason for its rejection, rather than there being no substance in the complaint itself.
Yeah.
So again, I suppose it's about where independent persons are contacted by complainants, that the independent person should urge for as much evidence as possible to be provided, so that the decision made by the monitoring officer and the independent person can be substantiated or based on evidence rather than simple conjecture.
Okay, reasonable. The only point the question I would ask myself is, have we ever been asked for advice by a complainant? And I'm not sure whether we have. We've certainly been asked for advice as independent members by subject members.
Right.
But I'm not sure that I can recall. I looked at it and said, have you ever been asked? We don't think it happened. We think complainants are full of themselves when they. Sorry, that's probably overstating the case grossly. Many complaints are justified and quite right.
May I comment? May I comment?
I'm afraid no.
No. But I think the evidence seems to be that on the whole, complainants feel that they made their complaint and don't need support to do it. And I don't think we've had any case, I certainly don't recall any case of a complainant asking that. It would be interesting if that did happen, because it would probably suggest that there was quite a serious complaint there. And so that deals with 22 and probably 23 and 24 as well, because they all have the same outcomes and they're all very, very similar. Is that okay?
So, Chairman, I mean,
Yeah.
I've got a note here, but I can't find on the appendix 22, page 313. Am I right in thinking that in section 1, the forename and the surname have been on the wrong box? The other way around.
It's either that or the name in the covering sheet, the
Table.
table is incorrect.
It's incorrect. It's the wrong way around. That's right. I knew I made a note. I just, thank you. That's on page 14.
Yes, yes, yes,
The top.
yes. It's the name shown for the complainant
Yes.
on the table is the first name of the complainant
Yes.
rather than the surname.
Sorry, it was just a
Yes,
small
no,
point.
well
I looked
spotted.
at.
Well spotted. All right. Anything else on 22, 23 or 24? If not, let's move to 25. This was a breach of the code. A public apology proposed. Views on that? That seem a reasonable outcome. Again, by now we're looking at cases which are being dealt with within quite reasonable timescales. So turning something around within essentially 4 weeks, 4.5 weeks, given the way things have to work and go out to consultation and views of subject members and everything else is beginning to look a bit more reasonable. So that's looking as though things are beginning to get under control. Any other comments on this?
So,
Yeah,
just the actual qualification of a public apology, this is opposed to a written apology, is it? So it's made during the public meeting. Would the complainant, would the subject member know the difference?
The copies of the decision are shared with the clerks as well. So if they have any questions as to what the form of apology should be, the clerks are fully aware.
Is this something that might be useful? Interesting question about,
Yes.
because there are clearly cases where it's an apology to an individual, and that's straightforward. But the question of an apology to the council,
Yes.
it
We
should.
can certainly take that to make it a bit clearer if that was
It
necessary.
might be useful to make that clear. In this particular circumstance, it would seem entirely appropriate for the individual to stand up at a council meeting and publicly say, "I'm sorry, I got this wrong." That
And
would seem,
presumably it will be recorded in the minutes of that meeting.
of course, but that rather than have it recorded as a written apology for something like this, simply because of the nature of the offence. The complaint is about someone who says they, apparently they told it, they didn't tell the truth about what they'd actually done. That seems reasonable for, if you like, public humiliation. Right? That's what it amounts to. So clarity about public versus written apology. Okay. Any other comments on that one? If not, let's finally move to number 26, where no breach was found. This actually relates to quite a complicated matter, which seems, most of which have nothing whatever to do with the parish council. All credit to Cornwall to actually try and work it out. But any comments on it?
One basic comment, if you're going to put in the structure paper, then for goodness sake, get someone to type it out.
Yes.
I think reading pages of, it's relatively clear handwriting, but still, get it typed out.
I think, well, it's a good recommendation, but I don't think that's something that the council
No.
can enforce.
We can't enforce it.
We do request it through an electronic submission of our code of conduct forms, but they can't enforce it.
You can't enforce it there, but
Presumably then they just fax it to you. As opposed to typing it.
I'm not sure the council actually owns a fax machine.
I mean, some of them are incredible, drug and satanic abuses,
Yeah, well, yes. There is some very odd stuff there.
very odd
Yes,
stuff, I thought.
Very odd stuff. It's part of the light relief of dealing with complaints
Yes.
that we have to deal with that.
Mm.
Right, that comes to the end of the looking at the appendices. Richard, you wanted to bring up a couple of 3 points.
It's been dealt with in the first point I made. So
Okay,
This was to do with the delegation.
Okay,
Thank you.
you're content with that. Okay, fine. Well, let me try and summarise the key bits that we've picked out of today's meeting. First of all, we've asked the monitoring officer to provide the date of the earliest outstanding complaint, the date at which it was submitted. Second point, the reminder to start the recruitment process for independent persons. Third, we're recognising the pressure that there has been on the monitoring officer, but also saying that needs to be resolved, and asking really that the Audit and Governance Committee take that on board and make sure that that is appropriately resourced. I think we noted the degree of detail that the delegated reports from Cornwall provided, and wondered whether that might be a useful model for Herefordshire Council to adopt. The suggestion of adding on the complaint form a question about whether there was an understanding of, I'm not quite sure how we word this, and this will need some thought, but this is about was the councillor acting in a personal capacity or as a councillor? And that's actually quite critical on many of these ones that relate, for instance, to planning, as well as the ones about social media. And the fact that someone answers that question doesn't mean to say that the monitoring officer or the independent persons will necessarily accept that view, but I think it may be a useful question to ask. Need to ensure that there is a remedy provided on each form, or if no remedy, to note that there is no remedy, and perhaps a subheading on the form,
Recommendation.
on the outcome form to make sure that happens. We would like, in the event that there is a public interest decision made, that is in relation to a complaint that otherwise might be rejected, but where there might be a public interest, then we're asking for a justification from the monitoring officer, for a brief justification from the monitoring officer on how the public interest argument would apply. And the last point that we came up with is the question of clarity around the nature of if you like, a corporate, an apology to a corporate body, and the distinction between a written apology or a public apology, and what that might mean. So those, I think, are the key things that we've picked out of today's meeting, which is quite a lot. Richard,
Just on that last one, it's just a question of process, which I'm ignorant of. But let us say, hypothetical situation, I have a complaint against me as a councillor, which I'm not anymore. I'm found in breach of the code of conduct. And the monitoring officer recommends that I give an apology, whether it be written or public. And I refuse. Monitoring officer has no jurisdiction over a parish or town council. Would it then be up to the complainant to enter another breach of the code of conduct that that individual failed to carry out the recommendation of the monitoring officer having been found originally in breach of the code of conduct?
There are two routes to that. One is the simple answer, yes. The second answer is the one that I think Eric Pickles gave when he introduced the Localism Act, which is that it's up to the ballot box,
You've got to wait 4 years.
which you may have to wait for. And of course, there are questions about whether that works or not.
Yeah.
But they have to recognise that that is the other route.
It won't offer comfort, but the strength of sanctions that can be used in relation to code of conduct is one of the outstanding matters being considered by the Centre for Standards in Public Life. But we are still waiting for them to come to a conclusion and recommendation that there is a recognition that a number of the sanctions are not effective.
Yeah, I mean, yes, those of us who go back to the introduction of the Localism Act will recognise that what that introduced was a number of changes which at the time we saw as weakening the operational standards.
There's no bite.
No bite, and in particular, no oversight of the smaller councils by the unitary authority, and I think that was something that was lost in the Localism Act.
I think it was pointed out at the time, but
It certainly was,
wasn't
very
it?
strongly, very
But,
strongly.
Mr. Pickles was not prepared to change it.
And some people say, oh, well, the ombudsman, but of course the ombudsman has no authority over town and parish councils.
No, the only body that might have is the audit body.
Yes.
But even that would probably not look at these matters and might not be resourced to. Very well. Have we reached a conclusion? If we have, then can I thank you all for your attendance, and I'm happy to declare this meeting closed at 8 minutes past 3.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Do we have?
And has the recording been stopped?
That's all.